Well, we begin with new details regarding the effort by Biden's inner circle to gaslight you, insisting the former president was mentally sharp. He was fit to serve another term. They told us this repeatedly. President Trump is accusing those around Biden of taking advantage of his mental decline. Here's what he posted. Quote, "They stole the presidency of the United States and put us in great danger. This is treason at the highest level. They did it to destroy our country. The Joe Biden that everybody knew would never allow drug dealers, gang members, and the mentally insane to come into our country totally unchecked and unvetted. All anyone has to do is look up his record. Something very severe should happen to these treasonous thugs that wanted to destroy our country but couldn't because I came along." And a new Politico op-ed titled "All the President's Enablers" is raising questions about Biden's inner circle, citing all the bombshell details of 3 books on Joe Biden's presidency that jointly paint a devastating portrait of an ailing geriatric leader surrounded by mendacious aides and grasping family members. You know, Kennedy, I'm still stuck on this quote about 5 people running the country from Alex Thompson's book, and Joe Biden was at best a senior board member. So I want to bring up one anecdote. Hasn't been reported enough in my mind. It comes from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it's about Governor Shapiro. And it's about Jill Biden, who they called Lady McBiden because she shielded and cocooned the president, allegedly. But here's what it said.
And also sought power for her own means, like Lady Macbeth.
Like Lady Macbeth. There, thank you for explaining the reference. So here's what it said. "I have some concerns," Shapiro said, speaking to Biden. This is according to the book. He was citing recent poll numbers. Inflation was a concern among voters, but before Biden could fully respond, he was ushered out by who? The First Lady. "All right, we got to go," Jill Biden said before walking the president to the motorcade and driving off. This is the line that's interesting. According to the book, the abrupt exit made it clear to Shapiro that they didn't want Biden to hear how bad things actually were. That is interesting to me. To Donald Trump's point, people not just making decisions for the president, but shielding him from information. This is according to a Shapiro reference.
Yes, and if it is to be believed that it was essentially a cabal of 5 people who were running the country, then those 5 people and anyone they shared the details with had an absolute necessity to come forward and let the American people know just how bad it was, because it was more than just those 5 people. You know, and I know they tried to shield him from lower aides and resident staff members in the White House that have an intimate and close relationship with the First Family.
So let's go here. President Trump is in the doorway, about to welcome the president of South Africa at any moment. Again, there's a ton of geopolitical significance to this. President Trump welcoming refugees from South Africa, a subject of controversy there. And let's listen in for a little bit.
President Trump, how are you feeling, sir, about your big, beautiful bill today?
Very well. We're doing very well. It's very close.
How was your meeting with the Pope's brother yesterday?
Great. He's a fantastic guy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So that was President Ramaphosa of South Africa. And the context here, I mentioned the refugee situation, but the context is also that the Trump administration has expelled the ambassador, cut off U.S. aid, and threatened to boycott the G20. You also have a flank of Republican senators who are very upset that South Africa has cozied up to some of our adversaries and targeted Israel at the ICC. So there's a lot of subtext here, Harris, and we all watched that really explosive Zelensky meeting take place, and this has the propensity to have some fireworks.
Come on, we've seen a couple of these.
Yes.
None of them has really been lackluster, right? Just a couple things about this. So the G20, the host country of that will be South Africa, and the president has been toying with, well, he may not go. So this is what's being described in Johannesburg and their local media in that country of South Africa as a make or break session, depending on how the conversation goes. So speaking on Air Force One, when the president was coming back from the Persian Gulf region, the president repeated his claim that white South African farmers are being slaughtered and forced off their own land. The Afrikaners are descendants of mostly Dutch settlers who first arrived in South Africa in 1652. Secretary of State Marco Rubio elaborated then and said, just a couple of days ago, all evidence indicates that the farmers in South Africa are being treated brutally. So when the president has new accusations of South Africa out of control and committing genocide, this meeting could be tough. If we get to see it, it could look reminiscent of some of the drama that we've seen unfold, or perhaps not. When you're the host country on the G20 and you want the United States to come, maybe you handle it with a little aplomb. We'll see.
Yeah. We will see, and we will bring you those live images as they come. And in the meantime, Emily, we want to return to what we were discussing, the cover-up, the 5 individuals who led the country during the Joe Biden administration, who they were. And I want to postulate another name. His name is Mike Donnellan. This was really important to me. We have a picture of him. We'll pull him up. He's known Joe Biden since 1981, okay? That's before I was born. I was born 7 years later. That's how long he's known him.
That hurt like a dagger.
It hurt like a dagger. There's Mike Donnellan. You see him in the white, and you see President Biden. The reason I bring this up is there's an anecdote that 2019, listen to that year. So before Joe Biden's president, 2019, there was an 8-day grueling bus tour in Iowa in December of 2019. Biden gave his aides pause while doing prep. He struggled to remember the name of Mike Donnellan, who he's known since 1981. Mike Donnellan also reportedly got a $4 million salary on the campaign, we learned. So you forget the name of the $4 million man you've known since 1981. In 2019, before you all told us he should be president for 8 years.
Before Kaylee was born. Yeah, look,
Ouch.
I consider this,
Ouch.
first of all, I've been trying to think about whether this was an inchoate crime or not, right? And an inchoate crime, it means it unfulfilled. Conspiracies, right? And I've been thinking about the multi-layers of crimes like that and the multi-layers and the different gradations of culpability. Because to me, I see, let's start with the outer layer. That would be the media that simply swallowed what was fed them and ran with the marching orders of publicly shaming anyone who dared to question mental acuity or decisions or fitness of the presidency, or anyone, most importantly, who were covering it up, right? We saw that Jake Tapper and the like, right? There was that. But I don't think they actually knew the extent of what was going on. I think they just failed miserably to do their job, which was seeking truth and facts. But when you hear about these alleged 5 insiders, when you hear about these additional facts, it points to the most serious, orchestrated, premeditated conspiracy that was executed upon for years prior to the presidency. And you think about how much downtime this particular presidency enjoyed. Now it's so transparent. Every day, all day, we know where Trump is. We know what he's saying. We know where his cabinet members are. But the prior administration was cloaked in darkness. And so think about how many hours of a day I picture these alleged individuals just standing together and whispering and plotting, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, and taking it upon themselves to usurp not just the executive authority of the presidency, but the authority of Americans who put him in the Oval Office to say, not even the president should know. It is terrifying, and there needs to be accountability on the criminal realm.
There does, and potentially from the top. We remember this Politico report about Joe Biden saying this, that if there was anyone within the Biden brood who had the influence, never mind the responsibility to stop the disaster of the 2024 election, it was Jill, or Dr. Biden, as she insisted on being called, Lady McBiden, as she was referred to by a reporter. You know, and here's what gets me. Jake Tapper talked about a reference from his book.
Right.
And I'm just going to summarize it here. He said Michael Bennet of Colorado, a senator, was at a meeting in June of 2024 at the White House. Okay? He was very disturbed about how Joe Biden looks. As he walked away from the meeting, he said something to the effect of, and I don't have the exact words, no wonder our immigration in this country is so bad. And that's the problem. You had Joe Biden at the top and others. And when it connects to policy and you make that connection, that's why this matters.
You know, and especially in his last 2 years, you know, former President Joe Biden really, you know, relied on teleprompters and scripted speeches. And it's hard to say, but he hardly knew where he was. So I think the question that we need to ask is, like, who was calling the shots? And the post up from President Trump was very interesting because he said, you know, the Joe Biden that everyone knew would never allow, you know, gang members or, you know, people, they will not let him in our country totally unchecked. So the question we need to ask is, who was calling the shots? Who was running our country for the last 4 years? It's a very interesting question.
Who was wielding the auto pen? President Trump keeps bringing us back to that. And I know this, you know, Congress hasn't formed a committee, hasn't had much accountability, but President Trump, based on that tweet, seems like he is going to be forcing some.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.